Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am going to be reviewing Something to Talk About by Meryl Wilsner. Something to Talk About is a romance novel. It was published at the end of May this year, and it centers around two women, Jo and Emma, who both work in Hollywood. Jo's a former child star. She was on a hit sitcom, but she's since moved on to becoming a producer and a scriptwriter who has been dealing, with the cumulative result of decades of being a Chinese-American woman in Hollywood, which is a place that has not been historically very kind to Chinese-American women. Emma, meanwhile, is her assistant, who is also trying to kind of figure out what she wants to do in life. We are told that she is very good at her job. I'm not entirely convinced that she is, but that is not going to be the point of my review. At the beginning of the book, Emma ends up going to an award ceremony with Jo, and a picture's taken of them, and it makes everyone think that they're dating. So there's all this rumor stuff going on. There's gossip, there's paparazzi. There's also someone who might be selling information about them to tabloids and stuff. So that is all this external level of stress that then gets combined with the fact that they are internally dealing with the fact that maybe they actually do kind of like each other. But that is also very complicated because yes, Jo is Emma's boss, and that is a very complicated thing to navigate. I was very excited for this book because I love stories set in Hollywood. Just give me all of them, anything that deals with how movies get made, all of that stuff. I want it. And especially knowing that this was gonna be a book about a very successful woman in Hollywood, I was down for that, and I was even more down for watching these two women fall in love with each other over the course of this story. So I was very, very excited for this book. And just as a heads up, this review is gonna be pretty negative, but I wanna start out by saying that Jo was probably my favorite part of this book because I really love the idea of exploring what it would take to be a child star in an industry that is not particularly kind to its child workers, and turn around and actually come out of that very successful, to actually be able to take control of her career. And add in the fact that Jo is Chinese American, and there's all these added layers to it. And so there are ways that this story does explore that. There's this background story from Jo's career where she spoke out about this show that she was on that made her famous, and she spoke out about the ways that she felt she was being mistreated, and that led to her being blackballed, but she managed to reinvent her career. That kind of stuff I was very, very into. There's a few other moments where Jo's background does kind of inform specific things, but it's mostly just stuff her having to change her name from Chung to Jones, which is why you might not actually realize that this book has a Chinese American heroine until you actually start reading it. There's also a brief scene with her dad who basically just enters and exits the story to be homophobic, which also felt just a little bit of course, And so I don't know, this might just be me getting a little bit kind of picky about what my own preferences are in books, but I'm starting to get a little bit bored of books that, that are not own voices, that really fixate on the ways that being not white in America is a liability, in this case in Jo's career and in her family relationships and how she relates to her sexuality, and not as a bigger thing that's part of different parts of your experience, both good and bad. I think that this is a very difficult needle to thread, especially if you're coming at this from an outsider perspective. So it's not that this is something that I think is racist about this book or necessarily problematic about it. It's just a thing that I find very limited in books like this, and that are trying to approach diversity, but maybe, I don't know, are still somewhat limited in understanding what it is they're trying to do with some of their characters. Despite some of my frustrations with the way that Jo's character was written, the best parts of this book for me by far were when we saw Jo interact with the few friends she has, because she's really parsing through what friendship means to her as someone who's been, very isolated by fame for a very long time. But unfortunately, as great as those scenes were, they were almost always undercut by the fact that they're followed by bouts of jealousy by Emma, who is parsing this understandably strange and confusing situation with her boss, but who is also unable to make Jo's friendships about anything except herself. I'm being kind of harsh on Emma, and I think it's in large part because the conflicts that seem to be used to develop her character don't really make sense to me, and worse, they made Emma seem really self-centered. About halfway through this book, Jo develops a friendship with Emma's sister. It's one of those weird things where they just sort of accidentally become friends, and they're not really sure who is supposed to tell who about it, and so Emma doesn't find out about it until much later, when Jo has done a very nice thing for her sister. And I get that this is a weird, awkward situation to be in with anyone, especially someone you've got a crush on or someone you work for, and Jo happens to be both of those things for Emma. So I get that this would be weird, but again, it's very clear that this is just an awkward accident. It's not a deliberate act of aggression against Emma, but Emma, and really the book itself establishes this as a violation of trust that is so egregious, like that Jo has done something so egregious to her that Emma has to resort to being passive aggressive with her boss. And again, Jo has just done this like huge, generous thing for her sister, and Emma's response just felt so confusing and out of place. Like, I don't know, I don't have siblings, but I just feel like if someone had done something really nice for my imaginary sister that just like came from a genuine place of friendship that had no strings attached, like, I would be excited about it. And like, frankly, their friendship is none of her business, but like, the book continues to establish that she is right and like that this is Emma standing up for herself, and I don't understand what it is she's standing up for. Like, I don't know, this conflict made so little sense to me that I am still convinced that I am missing something. Like, I am kind of paranoid that this is like an interpersonal boundary that I am not aware of and have been unwittingly trespassing on for like ages now. And moreover, I feel like this conflict just reinforced like why you should actively try to not fall in love with your boss. I truly cannot imagine a functional workplace built on an assistant passive-aggressively pouting at their boss for doing a nice thing for their sibling, because neither the boss nor the assistant want to address the underlying supposedly romantic tension informing all of their interactions. And I say supposedly romantic because I do not find their interactions romantic at all. Mina over at Mina Reads talked about this in a wrap-up video, and I'm gonna link to it down below, probably because I was just so relieved to find someone else who had frustrations with this book. A lot of reviews will note that this is a slow burn romance, and that was something that honestly had me really excited to read it. I have read a lot of smutty books, but I prefer for things to err on the side of slow burn versus instant attraction. Like, Mariana Zapata is probably like the queen of slow burns. Like, her books I find are like almost like a masochistic affair. Like, you are going in knowing how much it's gonna hurt, because like 80% in, every time I read it, I'm like so panicked. Like, I'm like, is this the one that's gonna like break my heart? Because you've spent like chapters upon chapters watching these two people agonizingly build this emotional arc and connection, and you're just like terrified that they're not gonna even like make out. So all of that is to say that I am very pro a slow burn romance. This, however, didn't have any burn and it didn't have any romance. It was just slow. At 80% into this book, I didn't really feel any emotional connection between Emma and Jo. Like, you know, there's some awe on Emma's side along with her jealousy, and Jo seems like confused and a little bit protective, I guess, but I wasn't really invested in the why or what or how of it all. I think one of the challenges of writing a convincing romance between a boss and their assistant is figuring out how to navigate the boundaries between like their professional and personal lives, like in the story. And I think it's really tricky. And for this book, I think the final effect was something really muddied, where like the more I think about it, the lesson to me is like, don't date your boss. There's also an extended plotline about sexual harassment, which involves Emma's favorite director, who turns out to be a creep. And it's a story that gets wrapped up in a very neat and tidy way that is like very different from how these stories actually go in real life. And which, to be clear, I think is not a bad thing. I think like a huge part of romance is like the element of wish fulfillment, like not just in the romantic plot, but like in the big shitty things that happen in the world that like surround the characters. I think that's like a huge part of the success of Red, White, and Royal Blue. But for me personally, and again, this is just strictly my own response, it's not necessarily something that I think that the book is doing it like super problematically or whatever. It's just like, having consumed a lot of books and podcasts and articles about the Harvey Weinstein investigation and really a lot of sexual harassment investigations in media and STEM fields, the ease with which this story wrapped up in the book was just so jarring that it really took me out of the book, and it just didn't land the way that I think it was meant to. And I think it's partly because that plot line is part of a story about a boss and assistant whose underlying attraction to each other creates a dysfunctional workplace, one where Jo, in her worst moment, fully demeans Emma in front of everyone to avoid suspicion. Like, it is truly, truly, truly awful what she says, and like, I think like Emma in that moment would have been fully right to just like walk off. And it's this thing where their underlying emotional relationship is interfering with their professional relationship and also affecting the workplace around them. Is that as bad as the sexual harassment storyline? Of course not, but it is weird to have that, like, those two things presented in like two different lights, where we all know like the sexual harassment is clearly very bad, but like the other thing is part of this romantic plot that I am like supposed to be invested in. I've been kind of having some angst lately about like whether I really want to be doing negative reviews anymore on this channel, in part because like I usually only pick up books that I'm excited for and that I want to do well, like this one. And so it's just like been an extended thing of just like trying to figure out like what I think negative reviews mean for me as someone who makes them, for me as someone who consumes them, and like for other people like watching this video. So as part of my angst, as part of this like internal dialogue that I was having, I was watching Mari's video about why she hate reads books that she put out a few months ago, in part because she's someone whose criticism, both like positive and negative, like of media, has like really been helpful to me. And one thing that she brought up for her was like the point that it's interesting to think about what makes the media we like and don't like work, or like not work, which was a helpful thing for me to think about when I was approaching this review, because I was just like, again, like I was just like, do I want to review this book if I'm just going to be criticizing it? And so I think the bigger question for me with this book, in terms of like the bits and pieces that work and like what it means, and I don't know, in my overall media consumption, is like, would this book have worked if it weren't about a boss and assistant? Like, especially right now with a lot of the conversations going on about toxic workplaces, especially in media, I think I might just like have very little patience for the antics that a boss-assistant romance requires. But with that said, a few weeks ago I finished a Korean drama called What's Wrong with Secretary Kim, which is also a boss-assistant romance. And I enjoyed it more than Something to Talk About, though it also had some truly, truly unnecessary plot lines about like a childhood kidnapping and like a memory transfer or something, and it was also kind of slow at times, so like I actually like fast forward through most of the show. I don't think it's fair to directly compare this show to Something to Talk About. You know, they're different mediums, they're set in different worlds, and Something to Talk About is contending with like these layered issues of sexuality and race in America that What's Wrong with Secretary Kim is not remotely having to deal with. But I'm bringing it up because while I enjoyed What's Wrong with Secretary Kim more than Something to Talk About, those two titles are way too long. The show does also have to contend with these issues of personal and professional boundaries. And while I don't always like it, I think it's a little bit more successful than this book because I think the show leans into what it is, a workplace romance. And that means that the workplace itself has to be really fleshed out. The surrounding characters have their own lives and romances, and more importantly, the show gets into the ways that this central romance that's driving the whole plot might affect the professional lives of these other characters as well. It doesn't like ignore that. Building out the workplace has the added benefit of giving more depth to the main characters. You know, it gives them a life outside of their interactions with just each other, and that in turn actually cycles back into the relationship that they're building. It gives that more depth as well. And I think ultimately that might be a big part of what I was missing from Something to Talk About, a book that I was excited for because it was set in Hollywood, but where Hollywood felt more like a series of plot points than an actual setting. The world of Joe and Emma felt so small, which does not have to be a bad thing, but I think if you're going to create a small world, you have to really commit and magnify the emotions that are driving their characters so that that becomes the setting in a way. But because the book didn't feel like as big or as committed in either the setting or emotion, for me, the characters became like very nebulous. They became very hard for me to grab onto, and so ultimately, I just wasn't very interested in their story. There's probably like a joke in here about how at least Something to Talk About gave me something to talk about, but it's not a very funny joke. Unless you laughed. If you laughed, it was hysterical.